The opening months of 1940 were marked by a deceptive calm. This period, dubbed the Phony War, saw British and French troops idly sitting behind the supposed safety of the Maginot Line, while Hitler consolidated his conquest of Poland. Both sides, it seemed, were content to wait. Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, confidently told the House of Commons on April 4, 1940, that Hitler, by failing to attack earlier, had missed the bus. The newspapers dutifully printed his words, and the public believed them. Just 3 days after this proclamation, Germany's armies invaded Denmark and Norway. But that was merely the prelude. The real catastrophe unfolded at dawn on May 10, 1940. Codenamed Fall Gelb, a colossal German offensive involving 141 divisions smashed into Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The world had never witnessed such warfare. This was not the static, grinding trench warfare of 1914. This was blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Stuka dive bombers screamed from the skies, acting as mobile artillery, while panzer columns shattered defensive lines that military experts had sworn were impenetrable. The well-regarded Dutch army, believed to be well-trained, collapsed in just 5 days. The Belgians managed to hold on for 18. What made it so terrifying was its sheer, unprecedented speed. Where World War I armies had measured their gains in yards per week, German mechanized units were now covering 50 miles per day. Allied commanders were mentally stuck in the previous war, expecting to have weeks to reposition their forces and establish new defensive lines. But by the time their orders reached the frontline units, the battlefield had already moved miles ahead. Radio intercepts were obsolete before they could even be decoded, and reconnaissance reports described German positions that had moved 20 miles by the time the report reached headquarters. The French had placed all their faith in the Maginot Line, a chain of fortifications along the German border so advanced it was considered invincible. Costing the equivalent of $3 billion in modern money, it was an engineering marvel, complete with underground railways, air-conditioned barracks, and retractable gun turrets. Yet it had one single fatal flaw. It did not extend along the Belgian border. The French High Command had made a catastrophic foundational assumption that the dense Ardennes forest in that region was impassable to tanks. They were profoundly wrong. On May 13th, German panzer divisions did the impossible, emerging from the Ardennes to cross the Meuse River at Sedan, the very same location of France's humiliating defeat in 1870. History, it seemed, had a dark sense of humor. Within a single week, these armored forces had driven a deep wedge, or sickle cut, separating the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, from the main French armies. Nearly 400,000 British and French troops were now being relentlessly pushed toward the coast, their backs to the English Channel. In London, the War Office was receiving dispatches that read like horror stories. Entire divisions were out of contact, supply lines had disintegrated, and every road was choked with millions of refugees, making any organized military movement impossible. Across the Channel, in Berlin, the champagne was already flowing. German intelligence was confidently predicting that Britain, its professional army about to be annihilated in France, would be forced to sue for peace within 3 weeks of France's collapse. After all, what choice did they have? The Royal Navy couldn't stop tanks, and Britain possessed neither the industrial capacity nor the trained manpower to stand against the Wehrmacht alone. Surrender was not just expected, it was considered a logistical certainty by nearly every military analyst in Europe. This sentiment was echoed quietly even in London, where Neville Chamberlain's government was collapsing even faster than the French front line. On May 7th and 8th, Parliament held what became known as the Norway debate, a brutal, agonizing post-mortem on the failed Allied campaign to prevent Germany's takeover of Norway. The criticism was scathing. In a moment of high drama, Conservative MP Leo Amery, quoting Oliver Cromwell's words to the Long Parliament, stared directly at his own Prime Minister Chamberlain and declared, "You have sat too long here for any good you have been doing. Depart, I say, and let us have done with you. In the name of God, Go! The chamber erupted. When the vote was cast, Chamberlain's formidable 200-seat majority had evaporated to just 81. He had technically won the vote, but he had lost the confidence of Parliament and the nation. Chamberlain desperately clung to power, attempting to form a national coalition government, but the Labour and Liberal parties flatly refused to serve under him. This left two viable candidates to replace him: Lord Halifax, the aristocratic, diplomatic, and universally respected Foreign Secretary, and Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty. Halifax was the overwhelming establishment choice, a man of peace and reason. Churchill was the polar opposite, a brilliant but erratic maverick, a former liberal who had switched parties, a man permanently blamed for the Gallipoli disaster in World War I, and who had spent the entire 1930s in the political wilderness, his constant thundering warnings about Hitler dismissed as the ravelings of a warmonger. On May 9th, Chamberlain met with both men to discuss the succession. When he asked Halifax if he would take the job, a long, fateful silence filled the room. Halifax eventually demurred, claiming it would be impossible to lead a war government effectively from his position in the House of Lords. Historians have long debated whether this was his true reason, or if he simply did not want to be the man to preside over what he saw as Britain's certain and humiliating defeat. Sometimes the most important decisions in history are the ones not to act. Thus, by a process of elimination, the burden fell to Churchill. On 6 p.m., May 10, 1940, the exact same day Germany launched its invasion of France, King George VI asked the 65-year-old Churchill to form a government. He wrote, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial." It sounds dramatic because it was. Britain was facing the greatest crisis in its 1,000-year history, and the man responsible for saving it was one who had been considered a political failure just a year before. He immediately began to form a true national government. He shrewdly kept Chamberlain in the cabinet as Lord President of the Council, partly to maintain Conservative Party unity and partly because Chamberlain still held loyalty. He appointed Labour leader Clement Attlee as Lord Privy Seal, and, in a critical move, made the powerful trade unionist Ernest Bevin the Minister of Labour, giving the working class a direct voice in the war. This was not political maneuvering, it was a necessary act of survival.
Churchill knew that to stand alone, Britain would need total national unity, a state where class divisions, party politics, and social hierarchies simply ceased to matter. But as he assembled his team on May 10th and 11th, the news from France grew more catastrophic by the hour. The Dutch Queen had fled to London. The Belgian army was in full retreat. French commanders were sending increasingly desperate messages about breakthrough after breakthrough. The terrifying question was no longer if France would fall, but when, and what Britain would do when it finally stood alone. While panzers raced across France, a different, more secret battle was being fought within the walls of 10 Downing Street. This was a battle of wills, fought in the new war cabinet over the fundamental question of whether to fight on at all. Between May 26th and May 28th, 1940, the 5-member cabinet held 9 grueling, exhausting, and desperate meetings that would determine not just Britain's fate, but the entire course of the Second World War. These were not abstract policy discussions, they were brutal arguments about national survival. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, proposed what he saw as the only logical, realistic course of action. Italy, not yet in the war, was still observing from the sidelines. Halifax proposed that Britain should approach Mussolini to act as a mediator for peace talks with Hitler. This wasn't surrender, a word Halifax was too sophisticated to use, but a negotiated settlement. Perhaps, he argued, Germany would accept something less than total victory. Perhaps Hitler would let Britain keep its empire and its navy in exchange for acknowledging Germany's total dominance of the continent. Halifax argued this was not defeatism, it was realism. France was finished. The entire British army was trapped at Dunkirk and about to be destroyed. What was the point of fighting on when the situation was so utterly hopeless? Churchill's reaction was explosive. He understood something Halifax did not. There was no negotiating with Hitler. Any peace talks would begin with Britain in the weakest possible position. Hitler would demand total disarmament, the surrender of the Royal Navy, and British neutrality while he consolidated his new empire. Once Britain agreed to negotiate from such weakness, every concession would lead to another concession, until its independence was a meaningless fiction. Churchill told the War Cabinet on May 26, "Nations which went down fighting rose again, but those which surrendered tamely were finished." The arguments continued for 3 agonizing days. Halifax relentlessly pushed his proposal, insisting that simply exploring the terms was not the same as capitulating. Chamberlain, exhausted and already suffering from the cancer that would soon kill him, wavered between the two positions. The Labour representatives, Attlee and Arthur Greenwood, quietly backed Churchill, but as junior members in a Tory-dominated cabinet, held little sway. The tension was so great that at one point Churchill left the room, and Halifax later wrote in his diary that he had considered resigning, a move that would have collapsed the government and likely forced the negotiations he desired. On May 28, Churchill made a brilliant and unprecedented political gamble. He bypassed the deadlocked 5-man War Cabinet and called a meeting of the full 25-member Outer Cabinet. He laid out the situation plainly, explained the military disaster, and then gave an impassioned speech about fighting on, about never surrendering, about how Britain might go down, but would go down fighting. According to records, the room of 25 experienced, world-weary politicians did not just agree, they erupted. Ministers cheered, shouted, and banged on the table, with some running to Churchill's chair to pat him on the back. This was the turning point. Halifax, seeing the united will of the broader government, could no longer press his case. The debate was over. Britain would fight on. The most terrifying part of these meetings was that they were held in total secrecy. The British public had no idea how close their government came to seeking terms with Hitler. Parliament didn't know. The Germans certainly didn't know. Had Halifax won those arguments, had Chamberlain sided with him, had Churchill been outvoted, the entire war would have ended differently. Germany would have controlled all of Europe. There would have been no staging ground for D-Day, no Allied bombing campaign, no Second Front. The Soviet Union would have faced the Nazi war machine entirely alone. Churchill had won his first and most important victory not with tanks or planes, but with words and sheer stubborn will. He understood that once you start asking what terms the enemy might accept, you have already lost. 3 days after becoming Prime Minister, on May 13, 1940, Churchill stood before the House of Commons to deliver his first speech as the nation's leader. He had barely slept. The reports from France were a relentless tide of disaster. German forces were crossing the Meuse, and the French army was in chaos. Everything was falling apart. Now he had to stand before Parliament and the nation and tell them what kind of leadership they could expect. The speech he delivered lasted barely 6 minutes, its notes scribbled on scraps of paper during brief moments between crisis meetings. It contained no false promises, no reassuring platitudes, only the brutal truth. He stated plainly, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." This was a radical, almost revolutionary form of leadership. Politicians don't campaign on suffering. They promise prosperity, security, and better days ahead. Churchill was promising the exact opposite: hardship, sacrifice, and quite possibly death. "We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind," he warned. "We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering." Then he defined the mission with stark moral clarity. You ask, what is our policy? I will say it is to wage war by sea, land, and air with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. He had elevated the conflict from a mere war over territory to a great moral, civilizational struggle. And then the closing line. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word. It is victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory however long and hard the road may be. And then the final, crucial qualifier. For without victory, there is no survival. That single word, survival, made it real. He wasn't promising a glorious triumph. He was promising a chance to survive, and he was honest enough to admit that even this was uncertain. The reaction in Parliament was mixed. Some MPs were electrified, others thought it needlessly grim and pessimistic. But the speech drew a line in the sand. There would be no negotiations. There would be no compromised peace. Britain would either win or it would be destroyed trying. That absolute clarity gave people something to hold on to when everything else was collapsing. The speech reached far beyond Parliament. The BBC broadcast it. Newspapers printed it in full. People read it in London's tube stations that would soon become their bomb shelters. Factory workers read it on their lunch breaks. And in Berlin, German intelligence officers read the translation and began to realize that their calculations, that Britain was weak and ready to quit, might be catastrophically wrong. This was not the speech of a government preparing to surrender.
This was the speech of a man preparing to burn his nation to the ground rather than hand it over. Churchill understood something that Halifax never grasped. People can endure almost anything if they believe their suffering has meaning. He wasn't offering them hope. He was offering them purpose. And sometimes, in the darkest moments, purpose is more valuable than hope. In Berlin, Hitler's intelligence services were watching Britain with absolute confidence, interpreting Churchill's fiery rhetoric as the desperate bluster of a doomed man. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, had spent years analyzing British society, and their reports all painted a picture of a nation ripe for collapse. They saw a country riddled with class conflict, still deeply war-weary from the trauma of World War I, led by a weak political class, and completely unprepared for the reality of modern warfare. Every analysis pointed to the same conclusion: Britain would fold within weeks of France's defeat. This assessment was not based on fantasy. It was based on what seemed like solid, logical evidence. Britain had spent the entire 1930s desperately trying to avoid another war. Prime Minister Chamberlain had flown to Munich and publicly handed Czechoslovakia to Hitler, and the British public had cheered him in the streets for securing peace for our time. Peace rallies had drawn massive crowds. The Oxford Union, the debating society of Britain's future leaders, had famously passed a resolution in 1933 refusing to fight for king and country. When Germany remilitarized the Rhineland, Britain did nothing. When Germany annexed Austria, Britain did nothing. The pattern seemed undeniable. The British had no stomach for a real war. Nazi leadership also fundamentally misunderstood the British class structure. They believed the aristocracy and the powerful business class would inevitably push for peace to protect their wealth and privileges from the chaos of a losing war. The internal cabinet arguments, where Lord Halifax advocated for negotiations, seemed to confirm this analysis perfectly. German intelligence noted that many in the British upper classes had social and economic ties to Germany, and had even expressed admiration for Hitler's economic achievements. Surely, they reasoned, these people would not allow their country to be destroyed in a winnable conflict. Hitler himself contributed to this misunderstanding.
He had studied the British Empire and convinced himself that its ruling class thought as he did, pragmatically, ruthlessly, and focused on self-interest. In his mind, once he had conquered France, the British would rationally calculate that fighting on was pointless. They would see that Germany controlled the continent, that invasion was now possible, and that their empire could only be preserved through a swift, negotiated peace. Hitler expected British rationality to lead directly to British surrender. He could not comprehend that by May 1940, rationality had become a luxury Britain could no longer afford. The Abwehr also completely misjudged Churchill himself. Their files described him as a washed-up politician, a notorious drunk, an impulsive romantic with a string of military disasters like Gallipoli to his name. They noted his age, 65, and assumed he lacked the energy for total war. They documented his wilderness years in the 1930s and concluded he lacked any broad political support. German analysts read his constant warnings about Hitler and dismissed him as a hysteric who had cried wolf so often that no one took him seriously. They saw all the evidence of his weaknesses and missed the one thing that mattered: his strength. What German intelligence failed to grasp was that war changes a nation. The Britain of May 1940 was not the Britain of Munich 1938. Chamberlain's appeasement had bought time for rearmament, but it had also done something far more important. It had proven to the British people beyond all doubt that Hitler could not be trusted. Every broken promise, every new aggression, every swallowed lie had served as a painful education. By 1940, even those who desperately wanted peace understood that peace with Hitler was impossible. The Nazis also catastrophically misread what the fall of France would do to the British psyche. They assumed it would be the final demoralizing blow. Instead, it clarified everything. As long as France was fighting, Britain could share the burden, could hope for a continental stalemate. Once France fell, there was no middle ground left. The choice was no longer complicated. It was absolute. Either Britain fought on, completely alone, or Britain ceased to exist as an independent nation. That stark binary choice united the very country that German intelligence had dismissed as hopelessly divided by class. The aristocracy and the working class were now bound by the same simple imperative: survive. While this political war of wills was being won in London, the physical war in France seemed utterly lost. By May 26, 1940, the British Expeditionary Force was trapped. Over 400,000 Allied troops, British, French, and Belgian, were pinned against the coast at the French port of Dunkirk, their backs to the English Channel. German panzer divisions had them surrounded on three sides, and the Luftwaffe controlled the skies. Every military professional who looked at the map reached the same grim conclusion: the entire force was about to be annihilated or captured. It was shaping up to be the single worst military disaster in British history. General Alan Brooke wrote in his diary, "Nothing but a miracle can save the BEF." That miracle was given a code name: Operation Dynamo. From a concrete room deep beneath Dover Castle, Vice Admiral Ramsay was given an impossible task: evacuate as many troops as possible before the German trap slammed shut. The initial estimate was tragically modest. They hoped to rescue perhaps 45,000 men over 2 days before the position collapsed entirely. The Royal Navy had about 30 destroyers and various transports available. But the math was brutal. Even working perfectly, the ships couldn't carry enough men fast enough from the exposed port. Then the first unexpected event occurred. On May 24th, Hitler issued a mysterious and still debated halt order, commanding his panzer divisions to stop their advance on Dunkirk. Historians still argue why. Perhaps Goering, head of the Luftwaffe, had promised his air force could destroy the trapped army from the air. Perhaps the generals wanted to conserve their precious tanks for the final push south to capture Paris. Or perhaps Hitler himself believed that Britain would be more willing to negotiate if its army was not completely and utterly humiliated. Whatever the reason, the 48-hour halt was a critical, life-saving reprieve. It gave the Allies just enough time to establish a tough, desperate defensive perimeter around the port. But even with the perimeter holding, the evacuation seemed impossible. Dunkirk's harbor had been bombed so heavily that large warships could no longer get into the main docks. Troops were spread for miles along the open beaches, huddling in the dunes as German artillery pounded them. Ramsay made a desperate decision. He put out an emergency call for small boats. Any civilian vessel of any size that could cross the English Channel was requested to sail to Dunkirk.
Hitler fully expected a peace offer within days. He had conquered the continent. Britain's army was shattered. The Luftwaffe vastly outnumbered the Royal Air Force. Surely now, with France gone and the situation undeniably hopeless, Churchill would be overthrown by reasonable men like Halifax, who understood that fighting on meant national suicide. Hitler even prepared what he considered a generous peace proposal. Britain could keep its empire and its navy in exchange for simply recognizing German dominance in Europe. The offer was never made because the request never came. Instead, on July 14, 1940, Bastille Day, another potent symbol, Churchill gave his brutal answer. He ordered the Royal Navy to attack the French fleet, its former ally, at anchor in Mers el-Khaber, Algeria. The goal was to prevent Germany from ever seizing those powerful warships. Over 1,200 French sailors died at the hands of their recent allies. It was a horrific, agonizing decision, but it sent an unmistakable message to both Hitler and, just as importantly, to President Roosevelt in America. Britain would do whatever was necessary to continue the struggle. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, and no surrender. Hitler finally had to accept what his intelligence services had gotten so wrong. Britain was not going to quit. On July 16th, he issued Führer Directive No. 16, ordering preparations for Operation Sea Lion, the full-scale invasion of Britain. But the invasion had one critical prerequisite. The Royal Navy was too powerful for the German army to challenge in the English Channel. Before a single German soldier could land on an English beach, the Luftwaffe had to achieve total air superiority. It had to destroy the RAF on its airfields and in the sky. Everything now depended on winning the coming air battle. The Battle of Britain began in July 1940 and reached its desperate, ferocious peak in August and September. Goering's Luftwaffe threw everything it had at the RAF, relentlessly attacking coastal radar stations, vital aircraft factories, and most importantly, the fighter command airfields in the south of England. The fighting was desperate and brutal, fought by young men on both sides. RAF pilots, many in their late teens or early 20s, were flying 4 or 5 missions per day, landing only to refuel and rearm before taking off again. Some squadrons lost half their pilots in a single week. Aircraft production, though miraculously high thanks to the efforts of workers at home, could barely keep up with the losses in planes and, more critically, in trained pilots. By early September, the RAF was on the verge of collapse. Fighter Command was losing more pilots than its training schools could possibly replace. A few more weeks of this relentless grinding pressure on its airfields, and the RAF would have ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Operation Sea Lion would begin, and Britain would be lost. Then Hitler made a critical, fatal mistake. On September 7th, frustrated by the RAF's refusal to break, he ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its main objective. It was to stop attacking the RAF airfields and instead begin the mass bombing of London. This was partly in retaliation for a small token RAF raid on Berlin, and partly a final frustrated attempt to break British morale by terrorizing the civilian population. This was the beginning of the Blitz, and it was horrific for the people of London. Over 40,000 civilians would eventually die in the bombing campaign, but it saved the RAF. The decision to bomb London gave the fighter command the breathing room it so desperately needed. With the pressure off their airfields, ground crews could repair runways, rearm planes, and service engines. New pilots from training schools could be integrated. Aircraft production could finally catch up. The Blitz was a tragedy for London, but it was a strategic gift for the RAF. By the end of September, it was clear to the Germans that they were not winning. No matter how many fighters the Luftwaffe shot down, the RAF kept appearing. The British radar system gave them advanced warning that German commanders could not counter, and critically, German pilots who bailed out over England became prisoners of war, while British pilots who bailed out over England could be back at their airfields flying another mission the very next day. On September 17, 1940, Hitler indefinitely postponed Operation Sea Lion. He never officially canceled it, but everyone understood the truth. The invasion was off. Britain was not going to be invaded. Churchill's words had been proven more effective than anyone, including perhaps Churchill himself, had dared to hope. Germany had won every single military battle in its path, but it had lost the only war that mattered, the war of will. Britain had not defeated Germany, that day was years away, but it had survived. It had survived long enough for Hitler to make his next fatal mistake, turning east to invade the Soviet Union in 1941. It had survived long enough for Japan to attack Pearl Harbor, bringing the industrial might of America into the war. The Grand Alliance that would eventually crush the Third Reich was forming. But it only formed because Britain had refused to surrender when every logical calculation said surrender was the only choice. Those 3 agonizing weeks in May, when Halifax argued for peace and Churchill fought for war, when the cabinet decided Britain would fight on, determined everything that followed. If Britain had sought terms, there would have been no Battle of Britain, no Blitz, no beacon of inspiration for occupied Europe, no partnership with America, and no D-Day. Churchill understood something that all the intelligence analysts and military experts had missed. Sometimes refusing to lose is more important than having a plan to win. You survive first. You figure out victory later. And in 1940, for the entire world, survival was enough.
The response was legendary. An armada of little boats set sail from the coasts of England. Fishing boats, pleasure yachts, private sailboats and river ferries. Piloted by their civilian owners, by bank clerks, by dentists, by fishermen, steamed into a war zone. The Tamsin, a 14-foot fishing boat, somehow managed to evacuate 7 soldiers. The Sundowner, a private yacht, made multiple trips and brought back 130 men. Over 9 agonizing days from May 26 to June 4th, a fleet of 933 vessels, of which nearly 700 were small private boats, executed the rescue. They became a vital shuttle service, ferrying troops from the shallow, chaotic beaches to the large destroyers waiting in deeper water, all while under constant attack from German Stoker dive bombers. The RAF flew over 3,500 sorties to provide air cover, though many soldiers on the beaches felt they had been abandoned, as most of the desperate dogfights happened miles inland. The cost was high. 6 British destroyers and 19 others were sunk. At least 200 of the little boats were destroyed. But they did not stop. The final count stunned everyone. The initial estimate had been to save 45,000 men. When the last ship left the smoking ruins of Dunkirk, 338,226 Allied troops had been rescued. It was, as Churchill himself would immediately insist, a colossal military disaster. The British had lost 68,000 men, killed, wounded or captured. They had abandoned all of their heavy equipment, 2,400 artillery pieces, 65,000 vehicles and 76,000 tons of ammunition. Britain's entire army had been driven from the continent, broken and disarmed. Yet Germany had expected total annihilation and the capture of 400,000 men. Instead, Britain had achieved a miraculous survival. The propaganda value was immense. The story of the little boats became an instant legend, a symbol of national unity and defiance. And most importantly, Britain still had an army. It would take years to re-equip, but the men, the trained professional core of that army, had been saved. They would fight again. On June 4, 1940, the very day the last boat left Dunkirk, Churchill stood in Parliament again. He now faced a new critical challenge. He had to transform this catastrophic military defeat into a national resolve to continue the war, now completely alone. He spent the first part of his speech laying out the military reality with absolute honesty. There was no sugar-coating, no spin. He detailed the German breakthrough, the encirclement, the desperate fighting. He praised the RAF pilots who had flown themselves to exhaustion, and the French troops who had bravely held the perimeter so the British could evacuate. He needed the nation to understand how bad things were before he could ask them to endure what was to come. Then he directly addressed the euphoria growing around the miracle. He stated bluntly, "We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations." He refused to let people delude themselves. But then, in a moment of rhetorical genius, he reframed what the defeat meant. Yes, Britain had lost the battle, but by saving its soldiers, it had not lost the war. The fight would continue. He laid out the strategic situation with that same brutal honesty. The German army would now turn south and finish off France. When France fell, not if, but when France fell, Britain would face invasion. Then he laid out the nation's new policy, a policy of total resistance. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France, we shall fight on the seas and oceans, we shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. Each phrase built on the last, expanding the scope of the coming struggle. Then came the crescendo, the lions that would define the very soul of Britain's resistance. We shall defend our island whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. This was an escalation, a promise of a people's war, a fighting retreat that would trade land for time, street by street, until Britain was either destroyed or Germany was defeated. He was painting a picture of Britain itself becoming a fortress. And then he added the final, crucial line, a line aimed not just at Hitler, but at Washington. And if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it were subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until, in God's good time, the new world, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old. This speech was a masterpiece, working on multiple levels. For the British public, it transformed humiliation into defiance. For Parliament, it was a clear, unambiguous statement that the Halifax-led faction was defeated. There would be no negotiations. And for the Germans, who received full translations within hours, it was a profound shock. Where was the peace offer they had been expecting? Where was the rational recognition that continuing the war was futile? Instead, this madman Churchill was promising to fight house by house. In Berlin, the speech caused genuine confusion. German intelligence had predicted Dunkirk would break British morale. Instead, the evacuation had somehow made them more determined. Hitler had won the greatest military victories since Napoleon, and his enemy was simply refusing to acknowledge defeat. The entire psychological calculation had been wrong.